Okay, in this session today, we'll look at the question, why do we get cancer? So if you look at the frequency of cancers, I'm sure a vast majority of us in the audience already know of someone who's got cancer or perhaps might be suffering ourselves. And the statistics are that 1 in 3 of us will get cancer at some point during our lifetime. So we will see a little more detail in the genetic basis of mutations or mistakes in our DNA that makes us more susceptible to cancer, and this we shall look at in week 2. But for now, what I want you to think about is this question. Now, we know for sure that mistakes happen in DNA all the time. And we also know that the frequency of these mistakes in DNA is about 1 in every 20 million genes. And this is in every cell of our body. And if you look at how many times cells divide in our body, the statistics are that about 10 million cells get replaced every second. So this suggests that the cell divides at such a high turnover. We also know that mistakes happen every time a cells divide. That's mistakes in our DNA called DNA mutations. So if this is the case, let me pose a question to you. If this is true, surely everyone in the world should have a higher frequency of cancers, and the sort of cancers that people get should be the same across the entire globe. So that means human populations should have the same frequency and types of cancer across the world. Think about it. Is this true? Chances are they're not, and we know it is not, because let me give you an example. If we do studies on siblings, twins, monozygotic twins, you will find that one might get cancer, the other one might not. There was a study that was done looking at populations in 2 countries, Japan and America. And the incidence of stomach cancers in Japan is much, much higher, somewhere around 80%, whereas it's far lower in the US or America. Now, here's the interesting bit. If you look at migrant Japanese populations in America, people who have moved from Japan to America, and look at the frequency of cancers in this migrant population, you find a dramatic change. Incidence of stomach cancers has dropped dramatically in Japanese migrant populations in the US. So what does this tell you? It's the 2 things. It's the environment, which plays a bigger role, and the cancer susceptibility genes have a smaller role in this. And there's lots of evidence to show this. In fact, almost 90% of all cancers that arise are due to the environment. And we shall look at that in a little more detail now. Among the main factors that contribute towards cancer development, lifestyle and the environment plays the biggest role, followed second by age. So the longer we live, the higher the risk of developing cancers. So why is that happening? Let's look at the evidence for this. So if I told you, way back in the 1800s, Sir Percival Pott originally discovered this link among chimney sweeps in Europe and the incidence of scrotal cancer. And he was the first to make this connection that it's something to do with their occupation, the fact that they have a lot of soot. And in those days, hygiene wasn't top of the agenda. Regular baths wasn't common. And as a result, there was an accumulation of soot, and he made this connection that it is the soot or the hydrocarbons in the soot that is linked to incidences of scrotal cancer. And this led to a whole change in laws, European laws, where regular baths was recommended, and there was a dramatic reduction in the incidences of scrotal cancers. So this was the sort of first evidence to show that there is an environmental link. We now know that cigarette smoking is associated with a high risk of developing lung cancers. Sir Richard Dall and his colleagues originally discovered this in the 1950s, showing that It is certain hydrocarbons, again, in the tar that is found in the cigarette, not nicotine. Nicotine is the psychoactive ingredient, but it's actually the tar in the cigarette that is linked to high incidences of lung cancer. So these are just a couple of examples to show you how the environment plays a role. And we now know that things like obesity, things like lack of physical activity, things like high-calorie diets, all of which increases the risk of getting certain types of cancers. We also know now, conclusively in fact, that viruses can play a big role. And one example of this is for cervical cancers, where the infection with a virus called as the human papilloma virus has shown to be a causal agent for developing cervical cancers in women. And in fact, we now also have a very effective vaccine that can be given to prevent cervical cancers in women. So HPV, or the human papillomavirus, is one very clear example showing link of viral infections with cervical cancers. But when I say this, please bear in mind that it's not simply one single infection with HPV that gives you the cervical cancer. You need a lot of host of contributing factors, and that includes things like a long sexual history with different partners, diet, lifestyle, smoking, all of which can increase the risk of getting cervical cancers in women who have been infected with HPV. So the stats are that even with about over 1 million women infected with HPV, not all of them will develop cervical cancer. Maybe 1 in 8,000 will develop this cancer. So there's a lot of evidence out there indicating certain agents in the environment that can lead to cancer development. And this is especially common for breast cancers, lung cancers, and other sorts of external melanomas. That's another example where you have exposure to the sunlight, where UV radiation results in DNA damage, and that DNA damage leads to instability of the cell, increases mistakes in the DNA, and can lead to skin cancers like melanomas. But there's one other factor that I wanted to tell you about, and that is age. In fact, if you look at the stats, almost 60% of all cancers that you see around the world is linked to age. And this is found typically in people over the age of 65. So this is a very clear-cut evidence that the longer you live, there's an increased risk of getting cancer. And why is that so? Why do we get cancers with increasing age? And there are a lot of theories about this. One theory suggests that it's our immune system weakens over time. And as we get older, our immune system is unable to cope with the increasing transformed cells in the body. Another suggests that it's increased exposure to various carcinogens as well as viruses, infections, etc. That means that mistakes or DNA mutations are increasing with increasing age. Also, exposure to hormones. Certain hormones increase susceptibility to cancer, and this is very clear-cut with breast cancers. There's also the oxidative damage theory. Now, this suggests that actually the human body is remarkably resilient. Each and every cell in the body has developed a whole series of mechanisms to counteract any sort of damaging agents, any mistakes in the DNA. But our cells get tired. So the longer we live, our cells cannot cope. The oxidative stress that is put upon each and every cell increases to such an extent that the inherent follow-up systems is unable to cope. And that's why there's increasing oxidative damage to the DNA, to the cell, and this leads to increased risk of developing cancer. So this is a very short summary of some of the lifestyle and environment and age-related factors which contribute to over about 90% of all cancers. However, we still have to have some sort of miswiring going on in our genes, the mistakes in the DNA or the DNA mutations, as I said. And again, we may inherit some of these from our parents, where it's an a gene that is increasing the risk for breast cancer, for instance. We can inherit an allele called BRCA1, which makes us more susceptible to exposure to any sort of carcinogens or lifestyle influences, and increases the risk of breast cancer. So this is simply a short summary of what makes us get cancer. In the next week, we shall see a little bit about the genetics in terms of DNA mutations and why that plays a key role in cancer development.